She walked in carrying everything she needed to win: the binder, the highlighted quotes, the voting record color-coded and tabbed, the carefully prepared opening statement that her team had workshopped until every syllable landed with the weight of a verdict. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered that hearing room, the way she always did, like someone who had already calculated the outcome and arrived simply to execute it in public. She planted herself at the long table, adjusted her microphone with the quiet precision of someone who had done this enough times to make it look effortless, and surveyed the room. Press photographers had stacked 3 rows deep against the back wall. The public gallery had filled to capacity before 9 in the morning. Staffers lined the walls and the spaces where security normally kept clear lanes. Something about this particular hearing had pulled people in, and the room's energy carried the static charge of an audience that had come expecting a moment. Across the table from her sat Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, calm in the specific way that career diplomats learn to be calm, not relaxed, not indifferent, but controlled with the practiced steadiness of someone who has sat in enough rooms like this one to understand that composure itself is a form of power. He picked up a pen. He wrote something on the yellow legal pad in front of him. One word, by the look of it, set the pen down. Looked up at her over his glasses with an expression that later, reviewing the footage, would look less like contempt and more like recognition, the look of someone who had heard this particular speech before, in a different language, from people who had paid a much steeper price for believing it. In 17 minutes, that one word he wrote would become the architecture of the most devastating exchange in a congressional hearing this year. In 17 minutes, he would ask her for a single name, one name belonging to one person, and she would not be able to provide it. But first, she had 17 minutes of believing she was going to win. You need to understand what she thought this morning was going to be, because the distance between her expectation and what actually happened is the thing that makes this story worth telling. She had come to expose something, not fabricate it. She genuinely believed it existed and could be proven. She believed Marco Rubio was a man who had once understood what it meant to advocate for Latin American refugees and had traded that understanding for proximity to power. She believed his record on temporary protected status, a program he had helped build and then helped dismantle, was the kind of documented hypocrisy that hearings were designed to surface. She had the paperwork. She had the quotes. She had the timeline. From a purely tactical standpoint, the preparation was solid. The argument was coherent. She had structured the morning to lead somewhere specific, and she had the evidence to get there. What she had not prepared for was someone who had also been building a case, someone who had built it differently, someone who had built it not around policy documents, but around a single devastating question that her own written record had made unanswerable. She opened the way she opens everything, direct, declarative, with the cadence of someone who practices conviction the way athletes practice mechanics. She told the secretary that the American public was exhausted by political theater, that the suffering of Venezuelan families was not an abstraction to be weaponized for cable news clips, that there were people in this building, and she gestured to indicate she meant the table where he was sitting, who had never personally fled anything, never gone hungry in a country that had stopped functioning, never watched the state decide that their children were acceptable casualties of someone else's ideology, and yet those same people had the audacity to deploy the pain of those families as rhetorical ammunition while actively harming them through policy. She said the word sanctions. She said it with the weight of someone who considered it a closed case. She delivered this directly to a man whose mother had cleaned hotel rooms in Miami to keep her children from starving in a country where complaining about that kind of treatment could get you disappeared. She did not know this yet. She would find out in 17 minutes. The room did not applaud. It held its breath instead, which in that kind of room means approximately the same thing. Rubio waited. This is important to understand. He waited past the moment when most people would have responded, let the silence extend one beat past comfortable, and then leaned forward. He thanked her. Genuinely, not performatively. He called the statement passionate and said he didn't doubt her sincerity. Then he took his glasses off, folded them onto the desk, and said he was going to skip the grand speeches about freedom because she was right that there had been too many of those and not enough specifics. She smiled, the thin, controlled smile of someone who thinks they just watched their opponent volunteer to stand on their own trap. "Go ahead," she said. "Let's talk about your quotes." He said he was delighted to do that, but suggested she hold on to that confidence because they'd be returning to it shortly. Then, instead of reaching for his own materials, he began asking questions that sounded almost conversational. How long had she been following the Venezuelan situation? Did she consider herself primarily an academic expert on the region? or was her advocacy driven more by personal conscience? She answered without hesitation. Both, she said. She would never apologize for having compassion. He said nobody was asking her to. He said he simply wanted to understand the precise geography of her concern. Because, he noted, there is a meaningful difference between caring about suffering and being selective about who you are allowed to blame for it. I call out injustice everywhere it appears, she said. He nodded appreciatively, and then he asked whether she remembered her public response to the administration's decision to recognize Venezuela's opposition leader. She said she'd called it out as imperial overreach. She used that phrase, imperial reflex, and it landed in the room the way she intended it to. He repeated the phrase slowly. Imperial reflex. He said he was a simple man prone to confusion and asked if she could help him categorize things correctly. If the candidate trying to hold a legitimate election represented imperialism, what was the label she applied to the man who had simply refused to release the vote count? She said she had condemned anti-democratic behavior on all sides. He let that phrase hang in the air for a moment. He observed that she used the plural constantly, all sides, complex dynamics, multiple stakeholders, and suggested those were very large containers in which a lot of very specific people could disappear. He said he wanted to ask something simple enough that anyone watching could follow it. During all her years of passionate advocacy for Venezuela, had she ever used the word dictator on camera or in writing to describe the man currently running that country? The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone present understands that the answer to the question matters more than the question itself. She said she consistently opposed authoritarianism in every form. He said that was not what he had asked. He asked about one man and one word. She said she opposed the anti-democratic conduct of his administration. He nodded very slowly, like someone who had ordered a specific thing at a restaurant and was taking a moment to appreciate the plate before acknowledging that it was exactly what he'd asked for. He observed that she had chosen to blame the administration rather than the administrator. He told her to hold on to that formulation too, because she was now juggling several things, and he wanted to make sure none of them slipped, and then he did something nobody saw coming. He reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He looked at it briefly, and an expression crossed his face that looked genuinely like admiration. He said she had actually written something about this situation some time ago that he found remarkably well phrased. He said he was worried that if he read it back in his own voice, she would accuse him of mispronouncing it or of stripping it of its intended tone. He said he did not want to be accused of putting words in her mouth. He slid the paper across the table to her, face up, her name visible at the top. He asked if she would do the room the courtesy of reading it aloud herself. Here is why she took the bait, and this is essential, because if you miss this, you will assume she was careless. She was not careless. She was proud. She looked at the document and recognized it immediately. These were her words, words she had delivered with conviction on national television, words she had defended in debates, words she had never felt a moment's shame about. There was nothing embarrassing on that page, from her perspective. There was no scandal, no contradiction she could see, no exposed inconsistency. He was handing her what she genuinely believed was her own strongest material and asking her to deliver it in her own voice in a room full of cameras without any filter. She didn't see a trap. She saw a spotlight. She picked up the page and read it with the confidence of someone performing a greatest hit at their own concert. She read that addressing the asylum crisis required confronting American foreign policy choices and the global dynamics feeding it. She read the part about how sanctions had contributed to displacing millions from Venezuela. She set the page down with a look that said, "There, that is my position, and I stand by every word." He waited. He said he genuinely appreciated the delivery. He said he believed she meant it, and then he asked one small favor before they moved on. He pointed out that her statement contained two specific names, his name and the president's name. She had made it personal by her own choice. So, he said he simply wanted her to pick up that same sheet and read the section where she identified the man those millions were actually running from. She looked at the document. She said the statement's focus was on economic sanctions, not on naming specific individuals. He gently corrected her, "Secretary, not senator." He said without malice, and somehow that quiet precision made the correction land harder than any aggressive interjection could have. He acknowledged that she had confirmed the absence of the dictator's name. He said that was precisely his point. He asked how a person could write a full explanation for why 8 million human beings abandoned their homes, find sufficient space to name 2 American officials by name, and yet never once include the name of the man whose prisons those people were actually trying to escape. She had read it aloud herself. Everyone in the room had heard it. The name wasn't there. The first laugh came from the third row, a man who tried to cover his mouth and failed. A security guard near the railing who suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the involuntary sound people make when an irony becomes undeniable. She came back hard. Give her credit for that. She was not the kind of politician who surrendered a room without a fight, and she knew how to find the footing when the ground had shifted. She announced she knew exactly what he was doing. Her voice climbed into the register she used when she needed to reclaim a space. She called it a performance, accused him of converting a serious discussion about human suffering into a moment engineered for social media. She said since he was suddenly so interested in names, they needed to talk about the 500,000 Venezuelans with legal protection status he had personally moved to terminate. She lifted her highlighted documents, the weapons she had walked in carrying, and read from his own letter to Homeland Security, the one characterizing the protection of those refugees as contrary to the national interest. She told him directly, "You do not get to lecture anyone about compassion for Venezuelans when you personally sign the paperwork to send 500,000 of them back into danger." It was a genuine hit. The journalist's pens moved. The aide behind her nodded. The man who laughed earlier was now studying the floor with the focused attention of someone who did not want to be caught on which side of this moment they were sitting. She had landed the counter. The room wavered. Behind Rubio, an aide leaned in and spoke 2 sentences directly into his ear, close enough to block lip readers. The cameras caught the exchange, but not the words. He gave a single small nod. Whatever had been communicated, it did not alter his expression by a measurable degree. He moved a closed folder a few inches closer to his right hand. He did not open it. The room noticed. You could feel the collective attention shift toward that folder, like a compass needle swinging north. He had the specific discipline to let it sit there, closed, and let the sealed possibility of its contents do more work than any document could do open. After about 15 seconds of this, 15 seconds that stretched like much longer, he spoke. He said she was right. The room froze. He said she was correct about his position on ending the protection program. He acknowledged it was a brutal decision. He said genuine families were harmed by it. He said he had thought about those specific families far more than she would ever believe, offered in a tone that was flat in a way that flatness rarely manages to be, completely devoid of performance, which made it land harder than any display of emotion. He said he would debate that policy with her if she genuinely wanted to. He might even concede some points. But he said that was not the fight she had actually come here to start. He said she had come to convince the people watching that he did not care about Venezuelans. He wanted to address that directly. And he wanted to address it because he believed she actually believed her own argument, and that the firmness of her belief came from a specific kind of inexperience. Then the Secretary of State set down his polish. His mother, he said quietly, cleaned hotel rooms. His father stood behind a bar at parties where wealthy guests never learned his name, pouring drinks until past 2 in the morning, then coming home and doing it again the next day. They did this in America because they had left an island where one man decided that citizens were not permitted to leave, to complain, to choose. And for anyone who tried, that man had places, specific dark places. He opened the folder. He did not pull out a legal brief. He did not produce a policy document or a statistical exhibit. He took out one photograph. Old, faded at the edges, with the color slightly wrong, the way photographs from that era always are. He did not hold it up for the cameras. He set it face up on the desk, visible only to the first few rows. He said it was the hotel. Someone had sent it to his office that morning, knowing the topic of the hearing. He pointed to a specific part of the image, a loading dock barely visible at the edge of the frame. He said his mother used that entrance every morning for 11 years. He kept the photo, he said, because on days like today, it was a useful reminder that the people being discussed in these chambers as policy variables were real human beings who punched time cards and carried names that the people throwing parties around them never thought to ask. He closed the folder. He said she kept using a specific phrase, that people were fleeing sanctions. He said he had grown up alongside these people. He had sat in their kitchens. He knew them, and he was telling her, with whatever authority that proximity granted, that they were not running from a piece of paper. They were running from a man she had spent 6 years in office declining to name. "You do not get to do that," she said, and the heat in her voice was real now, not performed, because she could feel the room's energy draining toward him, and she was watching it happen in real time without being able to stop it. She called it manipulation. She said he was using the story of his family to armor a policy position against critique, that anyone who questioned the legislation would be framed as attacking his mother, and that this was a tactic, a deliberate, calculated tactic, and she was not going to participate in it. She said explicitly, "I am not attacking his mother. I am challenging his voting record. Those are different things, and you are hiding behind one to avoid answering for the other." It was the sharpest argument she had left, and for half a second, genuinely, the room wavered again. Because she was not entirely wrong. Personal biography is frequently deployed as rhetorical armor in these exchanges. She identified the mechanism correctly, and the identification, delivered with that kind of precision, had the potential to shift the ground back toward her. That was when the woman in the gray cardigan stood up. She was in the fourth row. She had been there since before the hearing began, sitting quietly, gripping a folded program with both hands, unnoticed by the press and the cameras and the staffers running on the current of the morning's anticipated confrontation. No one had paid her any attention. By the time the day was over, no one in that room would forget her face. A security officer moved toward her. Rubio raised one hand slightly, a gesture toward the chairman, and asked quietly if the woman might be permitted to speak. The chairman paused and nodded. The officer stepped back. Her English was careful. The kind of careful that belongs to someone for whom each word costs something. She said her name did not matter. She said she had come from Maracaibo in 2018. She said she had been listening to the representative's explanation that the people in her country were fleeing economic policy, fleeing sanctions. She said she wanted to clarify what they were actually fleeing. She said her son was 24 years old when security forces took him in 2017. He had attended a protest. He disappeared for 9 months. When she was finally permitted to see him, he could not hold a cup of water. She did not explain further what had been done to his hands. She did not need to. She was not crying. She was past crying in the way that certain kinds of grief eventually carry you past the place where tears are adequate. She said she had followed the representative for years. She was famous. She claimed to speak for people like the woman standing in the fourth row. But in all that time, all those television appearances, all those passionate statements, she had never once heard her say the name of the man who still carried her son's hands on his conscience. She sat back down. The room did not laugh. What the woman said landed somewhere below the level where laughter lives, in the place where judgments form and do not move again. Ocasio-Cortez's composure cracked in a way that was not theatrical. You could see it, the genuine fissure of someone whose emotional response was authentic even when the political situation was not. She said she was deeply sorry for what that family had endured. The apology was real. You could hear it. Rubio did not press. He spoke quietly enough that people in the back rows had to lean forward. He said he believed her apology. He wanted it on the record that he did not consider her a cruel person. But he said she represented something more difficult than cruelty in the political landscape. He said she had decided, somewhere along the way, which countries were permitted to be villains in the narrative she had built. The man in Caracas had not made that list, because naming him would require admitting that the ideological tradition she inhabited was capable of producing exactly what that woman's son had experienced. He gestured toward the fourth row, barely, just enough. She started to say, with all due respect, the parliamentary reflex of someone reaching for formality when substance has run out. He stopped her, gently. He said they were past respect. He said respect existed 20 minutes ago, before she stood up and told a room containing a mother who had lost her son's hands, that the people fleeing that reality were primarily fleeing a document. He picked up the sheet she had read from earlier. He held it up, not dramatically, just high enough for the cameras to register. He said she had come today to prove that he did not care about the Venezuelan people. Instead, she had read her own words aloud, managed to include 2 American names, and left the tyrant's identity blank. He put the paper down flat on the wood. He said she tried to silence him by using their suffering as a weapon, and she could not bring herself to name their oppressor. Those 11 words, or 10, depending on how you count, accomplished what 10,000 louder words had not. The chamber went perfectly, absolutely silent. She looked at the stack of documents she had brought, the highlighted quotes, the tabbed evidence, the color-coded timeline she had prepared as a weapon for this morning. She looked at them for a long moment, then she reached out, and very quietly, turned the entire stack face down on the desk. She pushed them a few inches away. She picked up her pen and held it over her notepad, the way someone holds a tool they are no longer going to use. She set the pen back down without writing anything. The chairman cleared his throat and asked, with careful neutrality, if she wished to continue. Her time had not expired. She said 2 words. I yield. In a room so quiet the air conditioning was audible, the sound of that stack of paper being turned face down was the loudest thing on the microphones. The clip was online before the hearing officially adjourned. Someone isolated 90 seconds, her reading her own statement with total confidence, his soft request for the missing name, the paper going face down. They posted it without commentary. By mid-afternoon, it had become the kind of footage that the algorithm treats like oxygen. The public was not debating the policy merits of temporary protected status or the mechanics of sanctions regimes. They were watching a woman read a document she had written herself, get asked for one name, and go silent. On a loop, in 4 languages with subtitles, shared across platforms by people who had never closely followed Venezuelan foreign policy in their lives. A network aired the still frame of her hand, resting on the overturned papers with a single line of text at the bottom of the screen. Just his final sentence, no anchor commentary, no expert panel, just the words in white on black, and the image of the document she had walked in, carrying and set aside. In the hallway outside the chamber, a Democratic congressman who had voted alongside her for years agreed to speak to a reporter briefly, off the record. He scanned the corridor in both directions before talking. He said everyone in their coalition had known about the blind spot for years. He said there had been an unspoken agreement not to probe it. You could say anything you wanted about allied governments, about administration officials, about American foreign policy dating back decades. But the specific man in Caracas, that name operated under different rules. No one had ever forced a direct reckoning with why. He said she got asked the obvious question on live television by the one person in the building whose family had actually lived the answer. He walked away before the reporter could follow up. In a quiet corridor on the building's far side, away from cameras and journalists, the Secretary of State waited near an exit. He had asked an aide to find the woman in the gray cardigan before she left the building. He did not bring a photographer. He did not bring anyone. When she came around the corner, he took her hands in both of his. He said something to her in Spanish, quietly enough that no one standing nearby could make it out. She nodded once. That was the entirety of the interaction. He let go, and she continued down the hall toward the exit, still holding the folded program. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, past the press corps calling his name, past the empty committee room where the most quoted politician in Congress had run out of words, past the spot in the corridor where the morning's entire carefully prepared architecture had quietly collapsed. He said the dictator's name once more, under his breath, to no one in particular. The way someone says a word they have been saying for 15 years and intend to keep saying, not as a conclusion, as a continuation. The woman in the gray cardigan left through the main entrance alone. No cameras caught her leaving. No journalist caught up to her in time. She walked out into the afternoon with the same careful, unhurried pace she had carried into the building that morning. She still had the program folded in her hands. What the morning produced beyond the footage and the clips and the commentary that would run for days on every platform with enough bandwidth to carry it was a specific kind of reckoning that political life rarely delivers so cleanly. There are 2 ways to be wrong in public. The first is factual error, saying something demonstrably false that can be corrected with evidence. This kind of wrongness is recoverable. You issue a clarification, acknowledge the error, and the news cycle moves on. Careers survive factual error constantly. The second kind of wrongness is structural. It is when the architecture of your position contains a gap that you have been carefully not examining, and someone finds the gap not through opposition research or investigative journalism, but through the simplest possible question. A single name. One word that should have been there and was not. This is the kind of wrongness that does not recover through clarification, because the clarification would require explaining why the gap existed in the first place. And the explanation for why the gap exists is the thing the structure was built specifically to avoid. She did not leave that gap because she was careless. She left it because filling it would have required confronting something she had decided, at some point years earlier, not to confront. The man in Caracas did not fit the story she had built. Naming him would have required revising the story. And the story was load-bearing. It held up too many other things for revision to be a simple matter. This is not unique to her. Every coherent political worldview contains the same kind of load-bearing silence. Every framework that makes sense of complicated reality does so partly by deciding which complications not to process. The architecture requires it. If you tried to process everything with equal weight, you would have no framework at all, just an undifferentiated mass of contradictory information that produces no actionable conclusions. The question is not whether your worldview contains load-bearing silences. It does. Everyone's does. The question is whether the specific silence you are maintaining is defensible when someone brings a simple question and a room full of cameras. Hers was not. And the woman from Maracaibo, whose son's hands will never recover, made that undeniable in a way that no prepared argument could have. Several hours after the hearing ended, a producer for a cable news program that had covered the morning's events was compiling footage in an edit bay somewhere in Lower Manhattan. She had been in this job for 11 years and had edited hundreds of congressional hearing clips. She told a colleague later that she had been looking for the moment to cut to, the specific frame where the story turned, the way you always look for the turning point when you're building a narrative package. She had assumed it would be the laugh, or the moment the folder appeared on the desk, or the apology. All of those were strong visual turning points with clear emotional valence, but when she went through the footage frame by frame, she found it somewhere else. She found it in the 4 seconds immediately after the woman from Maracaibo sat back down, not during the testimony. After it, in the 4 seconds when the room was absorbing what it had just heard and nobody said anything, and the cameras caught the faces of everyone present making the same private calculation simultaneously. She said she watched those 4 seconds 11 times before she understood what she was looking at. She was looking at the specific moment when a political position became a personal one, when the abstraction, refugees, sanctions, policy, advocacy collided with a woman holding a folded program and a specific, unhealed grief, and the abstraction lost. She said she had edited footage of a lot of hearings. Most of them produced nothing she thought about after leaving the building. This one was going to stay with her for a while. She said she did not know why that particular 4 seconds affected her so much. Then she said, correcting herself, she did know why. It was because, for 4 seconds you could see everyone in that room, the journalists, the staffers, the security officers, the congresswoman, the secretary of state, everyone, all making the same private acknowledgement that the thing being discussed was not actually a political issue. It was a human one. And they had all been treating it like a political issue. And that was the wrongness. And the woman from Maracaibo had made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. 4 seconds. Then the chairman cleared his throat, and the political machinery started up again. But for 4 seconds it had stopped. She said that 4-second stop was the whole story. She cut it into the package and filed the edit and went home. On the way out of the building, she passed a television in the lobby running the clip on loop. The confidence, the soft request, the paper going face down, and she did not stop to watch. She had already seen the part that mattered, the part that nobody clipped, the part that nobody shared. The 4 seconds after the woman sat down, when everyone in that room knew exactly what they had been doing and why it was insufficient, and the cameras kept rolling and caught it all, and the footage exists somewhere in an archive that almost nobody will ever watch. Those 4 seconds are the most important footage from that morning. Everything else was politics. Those 4 seconds were true. The next morning, Ocasio-Cortez's office released a statement, 3 paragraphs. The first addressed the policy substance, temporary protected status, the documented harm to Venezuelan families, the legislative record she had come to discuss. The second expressed genuine sympathy for the mother from Maracaibo and her son. The third defended her broader advocacy record and reiterated her commitment to the Venezuelan people. She did not name the dictator in the statement. This was not an oversight. Her communications staff is too experienced for that kind of oversight. It was a decision. The same decision she had been making for 6 years, now being made again in the full knowledge of what that decision had cost her the previous morning. Some decisions are so structural that a single devastating public moment cannot dislodge them. The architecture holds even after the exposure. This is one of the harder things to understand about political actors, that the gaps in their frameworks are often more durable than they appear, not because the people maintaining them are dishonest, but because the gaps serve a real function and filling them has real costs that the political actor has calculated are too high to pay. She had calculated the cost. She knew what it looked like now, exposed on national television. And she still calculated that paying the other cost, the cost of naming the man, of revising the framework, of conceding what the concession would require, was higher. Whether that calculation is right is a separate question. It is the calculation she made, and the statement the next morning was the evidence of it. Rubio did 3 interviews the following week. In all 3, interviewers asked about the hearing. He deflected from the political victory framing, consistently, not as a tactic but as a pattern that suggested he meant it. He said the hearing had not been about winning. He said the woman from Maracaibo had not come to that building to help him win a news cycle. In the 3rd interview, a journalist pushed him on the policy substance, the protection status termination, the letter to Homeland Security, the documented harm to families who had relied on the program. He did not deflect from this. He acknowledged the harm. He said it was a genuinely hard call and that he understood why people in good faith concluded he had made the wrong one. He said he would keep making the case he had been making for 15 years, not about policy, about the name, about the specific person who had made the policy conversation necessary in the first place. He said the name again in the interview. He said it the way he had said it in the corridor after the hearing, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. The woman from Maracaibo did not speak publicly after the hearing. No network found her for a follow-up interview. No journalist secured a comment. She had come to the hearing because she had read about it in a Spanish-language news outlet and had decided she wanted to be in the room. She had not coordinated with Rubio's office. She had not been placed there by any political operation. She had simply come, alone, with her folded program, and stood up when what she heard required standing up. This is the detail that gets lost in the framing of the morning as a political confrontation between two powerful public figures. Both of them had staff, preparation, experience, institutional backing. They were playing a high-stakes game they both knew how to play, with different levels of success on that particular morning. The woman from Maracaibo was not playing a game. She was in the room because her son's hands do not work the way they used to, and she had heard someone explain that people like him were primarily fleeing an economic instrument. She came to correct the record. She did not need a strategy. She did not need preparation. She needed 1 minute and the specific gravity of a truth that no political framework could fully absorb. She got both, and then she walked out through the main entrance, still holding the program, and the city received her back without anyone noticing she had ever been there. The hearing is over, the footage exists, the statement was released, the interviews were given. The clip runs on a loop for anyone who searches for it. What remains underneath all of that is the simple question that started it. One name, one person. The man those 8 million people were actually running from. The question did not go away when the hearing ended. It does not go away when the clip stops running. It sits in the record, in the transcript, in the unchanged text of a document that was read aloud in a packed chamber and found to contain 2 American names and not the one that mattered most. That absence is not a political point. It is not a conservative point or a liberal point or a point that belongs to any particular ideological tradition. It is just a fact about what was written and what was not, about what was said and what was not, about what 8 million people were running from and what name that thing goes by. The name exists. It has always existed. It is not complicated or ambiguous or subject to legitimate interpretive dispute. It is simply the name she did not say, and somewhere in a city that did not notice her arrive or leave. A woman in a gray cardigan is still waiting for someone in that building to say it with the same consistency and conviction they bring to every other name in the conversation. She has been waiting for 6 years. She knows how to wait.